She was born into a name that promised permanence, yet nothing in her life would remain stable long enough to feel real. Before she ever learned how to speak, the world had already decided how she would be seen: an heiress, an emblem, a continuation of something larger and older than herself. The surname she carried did not belong to her alone. It belonged to an empire of polished lobbies, quiet wealth, and controlled appearances. It belonged to expectations that had been rehearsed long before she was born. And yet, what the world would come to recognize was not discipline, nor restraint, nor legacy, but spectacle. A persona so exaggerated it bordered on parody. A voice that sounded performed. A life that looked careless, chaotic, and strangely untethered from the rigid dynasty she was meant to represent. It would seem, at first glance, like rebellion. But rebellion implies choice. And nothing about her life would ever be entirely hers to choose. Because long before the cameras, before the scandals, before the carefully constructed image that would both elevate and trap her, something quieter had already taken shape. A fracture between who she was expected to be and what she would eventually become. The question was never how she lost control. The question was whether she was ever allowed to have it at all. Long before Paris Hilton was born, the name she would inherit had already learned how to control what the world was allowed to see. The Hilton dynasty was not built on noise. It was built on surfaces, polished, quiet, and immaculately managed. At its center stood Conrad Hilton, a man who understood that luxury was not simply about comfort, but about perception. A hotel was never just a building. It was a stage, and everyone inside it, whether guest or employee, was part of a performance designed to reassure the world that everything was in its proper place. From the beginning, the Hilton legacy was not emotional. It was architectural. Order, expansion, reputation. What mattered was not how one felt, but how things appeared. This philosophy did not remain confined to business. It seeped, quietly and completely, into the family itself. Conrad Hilton's vision of success demanded distance. Control required detachment. The family that inherited his empire also inherited his silence, a kind of emotional austerity that disguised itself as discipline. Affection was not absent, but it was conditional, carefully rationed, and often expressed through expectation rather than warmth. His son, Baron Hilton, would continue this legacy with even greater precision. Under Baron, the Hilton name expanded into something almost untouchable, global, recognizable, and meticulously protected. But with that expansion came a deeper entrenchment of the family's internal code: protect the image at all costs. In this world, vulnerability was not simply discouraged. It was inefficient. Children born into the Hilton family were not raised to explore themselves. They were raised to represent something already defined. And representation leaves very little room for identity. By the time Paris would enter this system, the rules had long been established. She was not the beginning of a story. She was a continuation of a structure that had been refining itself for decades. Her father, Richard Hilton, embodied this inherited restraint. As a businessman operating within the expectations of both Wall Street and Dynasty, his life was governed by performance just as much as Conrad's had been. Success was measured externally: transactions, reputation, associations. Internally, there was little space for emotional deviation. Her mother, Kathy Hilton, represented a different but equally demanding dimension of the same world: social visibility. If the Hilton men maintained the architecture of power, the women were tasked with maintaining its aesthetic. Appear composed, appear effortless, appear flawless. The role required constant calibration: how to speak, how to dress, how to exist in public without revealing anything that might fracture the illusion of ease. It was not authenticity that was rewarded, but consistency. Together, Richard and Kathy did not create a chaotic environment. They created something more difficult to resist: a stable, polished, and quietly suffocating system where deviation was not punished loudly, but corrected subtly, repeatedly, until it disappeared. And yet, beneath this controlled surface, there were already fractures forming. The Hilton family, despite its image of cohesion, was not untouched by instability. Wealth had insulated it from consequence, but not from tension. Distance between generations. Emotional gaps that were never addressed, only managed. A persistent prioritization of appearance over introspection. The dynasty functioned not because it was whole, but because it knew how to hide its incompleteness. This is the paradox of old money. The longer a system survives, the more it depends on silence to sustain itself. By the late 20th century, the Hilton name had become less of a family and more of an institution. And institutions do not adapt to individuals. They absorb them. Paris was born into this absorption, into a world where identity was pre-assigned, where emotion was secondary, and where visibility was both a privilege and a risk that had to be tightly controlled. There was no explicit cruelty waiting for her, no singular moment that could be identified as the origin of damage. Instead, there was something quieter. A structure that had already decided what parts of her would be acceptable, and what parts would need to disappear. Before she had the language to question it, before she had the awareness to resist it, the conditions were already in place. The performance had begun long before the performer understood the role. And in a system like this, where everything is rehearsed and nothing is accidental, even rebellion does not emerge freely. It emerges as a reaction to confinement. The Hilton dynasty did not intend to break her, but it did not know how to let her exist without shaping her first. In a family where everything was controlled, childhood did not disappear. It was reorganized. For Paris Hilton, early life was not defined by chaos, but by movement, constant, disorienting, and quietly destabilizing. New York, Los Angeles, hotel suites, private spaces that never fully belonged to her. The environments changed, but the expectations did not. She was always being placed somewhere, and rarely allowed to settle. This kind of instability does not announce itself as trauma. It disguises itself as privilege, travel, access, exposure to the best the world can offer. But for a child, continuity is not a luxury. It is a necessity. And in its absence, identity begins to fragment before it has the chance to form. Paris learned early that presence was conditional. Her parents were not absent in the traditional sense. They were visible, socially active, structurally present. But emotional presence, the kind that listens without correcting, that allows without shaping, was inconsistent. Attention came with expectations. Affection existed, but it moved through the same filter as everything else: image, behavior, appropriateness. There was always a correct version of her, and an incorrect one. The distance between the two became something she had to navigate alone. Her mother, Kathy Hilton, understood the importance of presentation with near-instinctive precision. She had grown up adjacent to the same world, where social survival depended on reading rooms, maintaining composure, and never revealing too much. To raise a daughter within that system was not simply parenting. It was training. Paris was taught how to appear long before she was allowed to understand herself. How to dress. How to speak. How to move through a room without drawing the wrong kind of attention. But these lessons, while subtle, carried an underlying message. Who you are matters less than how you are perceived. And over time, perception becomes a mirror that replaces identity. Her father, Richard Hilton, operated from a different distance. His world was transactional, structured, external. Emotional complexity did not fit easily within it. His presence reinforced the same quiet directive: discipline, control, forward movement. There was no explicit rejection, but there was very little space for emotional deviation. For a child who was already restless, already searching for grounding, this environment did not provide resistance, it provided redirection. When behavior became difficult to manage, the solution was not introspection. It was removal. And this is where the system revealed its harsher edge. As a teenager, Paris was sent away, placed into a network of behavioral schools and programs designed to correct what could not be controlled at home. Among them was Provo Canyon School, a facility that would later become central to her understanding of her own past. At the time, it was presented as necessary. a structured environment, discipline, reform. But structure, when imposed without emotional safety, does not stabilize. It suppresses. Inside these institutions, control was absolute. Routine replaced choice. Authority replaced dialogue. And identity, already fragile, was further reduced to compliance. The message became more direct, more severe. Who you are is a problem that needs to be fixed. For a developing mind, this does not create clarity. It creates dissonance. Paris was not simply being corrected. She was being taught to distrust her own instincts. The experience would remain largely invisible to the public for years, hidden behind the polished continuity of the Hilton name. Another fracture absorbed into the system, unspoken and unexamined. But internally, something had shifted. When a child learns that their natural responses are unacceptable, they begin to construct alternatives, versions of themselves that are easier to manage, easier to present, easier to love, at least within the boundaries that have been set. This is not deception. It is adaptation. By the time Paris returned to the world she had been removed from, she was no longer navigating identity. She was experimenting with performance. A voice that could disarm, a demeanor that could deflect, a persona that could transform scrutiny into something else, something lighter, less threatening, easier for others to consume. What would later be interpreted as superficiality had roots in something far more complex. It was not emptiness. It was protection. But protection, when built too early and reinforced too often, becomes indistinguishable from self. And this is where the deeper tragedy begins. Because once a constructed version of identity starts to function, once it begins to receive attention, validation, even admiration, it becomes difficult to abandon. Not because it is true, but because it works. By the end of her adolescence, Paris was no longer simply a product of her environment. She had become responsive to it in a way that made escape increasingly unlikely. The system that shaped her had not broken her outright. It had done something more enduring. It had taught her how to survive inside it, by becoming something that could be seen, consumed, and controlled all at once. And in doing so, it quietly removed the possibility of ever being fully known. Control, when it finally appeared in her life, did not look like stability. It looked like visibility. By the early 2000s, Paris Hilton had become something the Hilton Dynasty had never quite prepared for, an image that moved faster than the system that produced it. She was no longer just an heiress. She was becoming a spectacle, a presence that could not be contained within hotel lobbies or carefully curated social circles. At first, it seemed like authorship. She leaned into a persona that felt deliberate, breathy voice, calculated naivety, an exaggerated femininity that bordered on caricature. The dumb blonde was not an accident. It was a distortion, shaped in response to a world that had already decided to look at her in fragments. If she was going to be seen, then she would decide how. Or at least, that was the illusion. Because what the public consumed was not control, but consistency. The persona worked because it was legible, easy to understand, easy to circulate. In a media landscape that was rapidly shifting towards speed and repetition, complexity had no advantage. Simplicity did. And Paris provided it in a form that could be endlessly reproduced. Photographs, headlines, sound bites. She became one of the first individuals to exist not just in the public eye, but inside the machinery of attention itself. And the machinery did not ask who she was. It only asked whether she could be repeated. Her rise accelerated through visibility, but it crystallized through narrative. In 2003, the release of a private tape, distributed without her control, transformed her from a social figure into a global fixation. The event was framed as scandal, but its deeper impact was structural. It removed the boundary between her private self and public consumption. What had once been performance became exposure. And yet, instead of retreating, her visibility expanded. This is where the contradiction deepens, because the same moment that should have destabilized her position instead secured it. Public attention did not diminish. It intensified. The system did not reject her. It absorbed the scandal and repurposed it as content. There was no space to process, only space to continue. Soon after, she entered The Simple Life alongside Nicole Richie, a show that would define her image with even greater precision. Removed from the environment she had been trained to navigate, placed into settings that emphasize contrast, she became a character within her own life. The audience did not see adaptation. They saw authenticity. The performance, refined over years of subtle conditioning, now appeared effortless. The voice, the mannerisms, the carefully flattened effect, it all aligned with the expectations that had been building around her. And the more it aligned, the less it could be separated from her. Fame, in this form, does not expand identity. It compresses it. Every repetition narrows the range of what is acceptable. Every successful performance reinforces the necessity of maintaining it. And slowly, the distinction between self and role begins to dissolve, not dramatically, but through accumulation. There were moments, brief and largely unseen, where deviation seemed possible. Interviews where the tone shifted slightly. Instances where the persona thinned, revealing something quieter beneath it. A different cadence. A different presence. These moments did not gain traction. They were not what the system recognized. And so they disappeared. This is how the illusion of control sustains itself, not by force, but by reward. The version of her that was easiest to consume was the version that was amplified. Everything else became background noise. Financially, professionally, externally, she was succeeding. Brand deals, appearances, global recognition. The architecture of success was intact, even expanding. From the outside, it resembled mastery. But internally, the structure was more fragile than it appeared. Because control, in its truest form, requires the ability to withdraw, to redefine, to stop. And none of these were fully available to her. The persona was no longer optional. It was operational. Even as she began to extend herself into business, fragrance lines, branding, early forms of what would later be recognized as influencer strategy, the foundation remained the same. The image had to be maintained. The tone could not shift too far. The expectations, once set, became parameters. Deviation risked erasure. And erasure, in a system built on visibility, is indistinguishable from disappearance. This is where the illusion reaches its most convincing point. Because from the outside, everything suggested agency. She appeared to be orchestrating her own relevance, anticipating trends, leveraging attention before others understood how to. In many ways, she was ahead of the culture that consumed her. But being early does not mean being free. It often means becoming the prototype others learn from, while remaining trapped in the original design. There was a moment, not singular but cumulative, where an exit began to form. A possibility of stepping outside the established image, of recalibrating the narrative before it solidified beyond recognition. It did not look dramatic. There was no clear turning point. Just a growing awareness that the version of herself the world recognized was no longer entirely aligned with anything internal. And yet, awareness is not the same as ability. Because to exit would require dismantling the very structure that sustained her visibility, to become less recognizable, less consistent, less consumable. And in a life where identity had already been shaped by expectation, where validation had long been tied to performance, the cost of that shift was not professional. It was psychological. The system had not taken control from her. It had made control indistinguishable from participation. And by the time she began to sense the difference, the role had already become too functional to abandon. What looked like power was, in many ways, dependency. What looked like freedom was continuity. And what looked like choice had been quietly narrowed long before she realized she was choosing it all. There was no single moment where escape presented itself clearly. No decisive crossroads. No visible rupture. Instead, the possibility of another life appeared gradually, almost quietly, layered between obligations, expectations, and the slow fatigue of repetition. By the late 2000s, the machinery that had once elevated Paris Hilton began to shift. The culture that had amplified her was evolving, fragmenting into new forms of attention, new faces, new narratives. What had once felt inescapable, constant visibility, relentless coverage, started to loosen its grip. And with that loosening came something unfamiliar. Space. For the first time, there were intervals where she was not being watched with the same intensity. Moments where the persona did not need to be performed with absolute consistency. The external pressure, while still present, was no longer total. This could have been an exit. Not dramatic, not public, but internal. A reconfiguration of identity away from spectacle and towards something less defined, less consumed. There were signs that she recognized this possibility. Her business ventures became more deliberate, less performative. The exaggerated persona softened in certain contexts. Interviews hinted at a more measured awareness, a subtle distancing from the version of herself that had once been amplified without restraint. But awareness does not dismantle conditioning. Because by this point, the persona was no longer something she performed only for others. It had become the interface through which she experienced the world. To abandon it would not simply mean changing how others saw her. It would mean confronting the absence of a stable alternative. This is the complexity of inherited and constructed identity. When it has been shaped externally for too long, there is no clear internal reference point to return to. Only uncertainty. And uncertainty, especially for someone raised within systems that valued control and consistency, is not neutral. It is destabilizing. The Hilton legacy had not prepared her for ambiguity. It had prepared her for presentation, for continuity, for maintaining coherence even when it no longer reflected reality. So even as the external environment offered a subtle opening, the internal framework resisted it. There were also structural reasons the exit could not fully take form. Her relevance, though evolving, remained tied to recognition, to a version of herself that the public already understood. Brand partnerships, media appearances, business expansions, all relied, to some extent, on continuity with the established image. To step too far away would risk not just visibility, but viability. And unlike rebellion in adolescence, which can exist without consequence, this stage of her life was interconnected with financial systems, professional networks, and long-term positioning. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were embedded. There were relationships, too, public and private, that reinforced the existing narrative. Social circles that had formed around shared visibility. Environments where deviation would not be openly rejected, but quietly misunderstood. And misunderstanding, when accumulated over time, becomes isolation. So the shift, when it happened, was partial, measured, carefully contained. She did not disappear from the role. She adjusted within it. And this is where the missed exit becomes most visible, not as a failure, but as a limit. Because the conditions required for a full departure were never entirely present. Not in her upbringing. Not in her environment. Not in the psychological architecture that had been forming since childhood. The possibility of becoming someone else existed only in fragments, never in full. And fragments are not enough to sustain transformation. They are enough only to create awareness of what cannot be reached. In later years, she would begin to articulate parts of her past that had remained concealed, particularly the experiences within institutions like Provo Canyon School. Speaking about them publicly introduced a new layer to her narrative, one that contrasted sharply with the image that had defined her for so long. It was, in many ways, the closest she came to reclaiming authorship. But even this moment, significant as it was, did not fully undo what had already been established. Because narrative, once fixed in public consciousness, does not dissolve easily. It persists. It overlays. It reframes new information through old expectations. Her voice, now more grounded, more deliberate, entered a space that had already decided how to interpret her. And so even truth had to pass through the filter of the persona that preceded it. This is the final constraint. Not that she could not change, but that change would always be contextualized by what came before. The exit was never closed. It remained visible, in pieces, across different moments in her life, but it was never fully accessible, because to reach it would require not just stepping away from the persona, but stepping into a self that had never been allowed to fully exist. And that is not an action. It is a reconstruction, one that demands time, space, and a kind of internal permission that her life had never consistently provided. So the system remained, not because it was imposed, but because it had become integrated. What could have been an ending instead became a continuation, slightly altered, more aware, but still bound to the same underlying structure. The exit was there, but it required a version of her that had never been fully formed. Collapse, when it finally settles into a life like hers, does not arrive as a single event. It disperses. It moves quietly through routines, through relationships, through the spaces between what is performed and what is felt, until the distinction between the two becomes difficult to locate. For Paris Hilton, there was no public unraveling that could be neatly identified as the moment everything changed. No singular fall from grace. No abrupt disappearance. Instead, there was continuation. And within that continuation, a gradual thinning. The persona remained functional. It still appeared when required, on stages, in interviews, across platforms that had long depended on its familiarity. The voice, the cadence, the gestures, they did not vanish. They adapted just enough to remain recognizable, just enough to sustain the connection between who she had been and who she was expected to remain. But behind that continuity, something quieter was eroding. Because performance, when sustained over long periods without a stable internal anchor, does not simply exhaust. It displaces. The self does not disappear dramatically. It recedes, step by step, replaced by responses that are efficient, practiced, and increasingly detached from any immediate emotional origin. This is not emptiness. It is overfunctioning, a state in which everything continues to work, externally, professionally, socially, while internally, the sense of authorship becomes diffuse. There were new directions in her life that suggested evolution. Her work expanded into global DJ performances, brand development, business structures that placed her less as a subject of attention and more as a manager of it. On the surface, this appeared as growth, a transition from image to enterprise. But even here, the underlying pattern remained. The system had not been replaced. It had been reconfigured. The same dynamics persisted: visibility as currency, consistency as requirement, recognition as validation. The difference was not structural. It was tonal. And tone does not resolve tension. It softens its presentation. Relationships followed a similar pattern. Connections formed within environments that mirrored the same expectations she had always navigated: status, visibility, alignment with a certain version of life. Intimacy, in this context, becomes difficult to sustain, not because it is undesired, but because it requires a level of unfiltered presence that the system does not easily allow. To be known without performance would require stepping outside the mechanisms that had defined her interactions for decades. And stepping outside them meant risk. Not dramatic risk, but relational risk, the possibility of being misunderstood, of being seen without the protective distortion that had long made interactions predictable. So the boundaries remained. Subtle, but consistent. Over time, this creates a particular kind of isolation. Not the isolation of absence, but of distance within presence. Surrounded, visible, engaged, and yet internally separated. The past, too, did not remain static. Experiences that had been contained, unspoken, or minimized began to resurface, not as sudden revelations, but as persistent undercurrents. The time spent in institutional environments like Provo Canyon School did not fade with distance. It remained embedded, not always consciously, but structurally, in the way authority was interpreted, in the way control was negotiated, in the instinct to comply or to perform when confronted with expectation. When she eventually chose to speak about these experiences publicly, the act itself did not function as release. It functioned as articulation, a naming of something that had already shaped her for years. But articulation does not undo formation. It clarifies it. And clarity, while necessary, often arrives too late to alter the foundational patterns that have already taken hold. This is where the collapse becomes most apparent, not in what changes, but in what cannot. Despite awareness, despite evolution, despite attempts to redefine the narrative, the underlying architecture remains intact. The same pressures, now internalized, continue to guide behavior even in the absence of external enforcement. She no longer needed the system to impose expectations. She had learned how to maintain them herself. This is the final stage of conditioning, when the environment no longer needs to correct you because you have already absorbed its rules. And so life continues. Appearances are made. Projects are launched. Public perception adjusts, slowly, to accommodate a more complex image, less caricature, more control, more intention. But beneath that adjustment, the original fracture remains. The separation between identity and performance, between internal experience and external expression. It does not widen dramatically. It stabilizes. And stabilization, in this context, is not resolution. It is endurance. There are moments, brief, almost imperceptible, where something closer to stillness appears. A different tone in her voice. A more grounded presence. A suggestion that the distance between who she is and what she presents has narrowed, even if slightly. But these moments do not redefine the structure. They exist within it. They are not escapes. They are variations. And this is the quiet reality of collapse in a life like hers. Nothing visibly breaks. Nothing decisively ends. Instead, everything continues, just with less illusion than before. The persona remains. The system remains. And the self, whatever shape it has taken beneath all of it, learns to exist in partial alignment with both. Not fully hidden. Not fully revealed. Just enough to function. Just enough to continue. In the end, what remains is not the spectacle that once defined her, nor the empire that preceded her. It is something quieter. A life that was never entirely her own, gradually learning how to accommodate itself. Paris Hilton did not disappear into the role that was built around her. But she did not fully escape it either. What exists now is a kind of coexistence between the image that made her legible to the world and the interior self that had to develop in fragments, often out of sight. There is no clean separation between the two, only negotiation. The Hilton name endures, as it was always meant to, polished, recognizable, structurally intact. The persona she once performed still lingers in public memory, preserved in repetition, in nostalgia, in the cultural archive of a time that rarely questions what it consumed. And somewhere within all of that, there is a voice that arrived late, more measured, more deliberate, not untouched by what came before, but no longer entirely defined by it. It does not erase the past. It exists alongside it. Because some lives are not shaped by a single turning point, but by an accumulation of conditions that make transformation partial, uneven, and always incomplete. She was not undone in a moment. She was formed in one. And everything that followed was, in some quiet way, an attempt to live with that formation, without ever being fully released from it.